In this documentary, we'll be covering the impact of Castro's authoritarian state on Cuban religion. While Cuba's historic ties with Christianity and specifically Roman Catholicism were prominent, the Cuban Revolution and Castro's rise in power changed the religious landscape completely. The Cuban Revolution was a political and military uprising that overthrew the then-current Cuban government of Batista and was led by Fidel Castro. The revolution began due to Batista's indifference and lack of action regarding Cuba's grievances. With the series of attacks, Castro overthrew the Batista government and took power in 1959. Through the following 8 minutes, we will be examining the religion in Cuba prior to Castro and the revolution, religion during Castro's rule, and the consequent relationship between Castro and the church. Prior to the Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a fundamentally religious country, but compared to its other Latin American countries at the time, it was relatively non-practicing. Only 75% of the Cuban population claimed to be Christian in comparison to other Latin American countries where over 90% of their population claimed to be Catholic. In a survey done in 1957, 2 years before the end of the Cuban Revolution, 41.4% of Cubans in rural areas said they had no religion at all, while 46.5% had never even laid eyes on a priest. The arrival of Catholicism was the result of the Spanish colonization of Cuba that occurred in the 15th century, and Catholicism became rooted into the history of Cuba as a result. However, besides Catholicism, historically, there were also African religions that were spread to Cuba during the slave trade, such as those of the Yoruba people of West Africa. The overall dominant religions in Cuba were Catholicism, in which 60% of the Cuban population, 5% of the population were categorized as other Christians, while 24% were non-religious. Regarding the relationship between religion and the Cuban government, the Catholic Church had a strong influence on Cuban society and politics. An example of religious influence over Cuban society was through the educational system, and Fidel Castro himself was educated by Roman Catholics growing up. However, interestingly enough, Castro grew far from his religious roots.
Did you know that Castro was a communist? Well, as a communist, Castro did not support religion in Cuba. Despite his religious upbringing, Castro's tie to communism drew him away from his religious roots and towards secularism in Cuban policy. In a Marxist communist society, there is theoretically no religion. Because of this, in 1959, after the Communist Revolution, the Cuban government began restricting religious practice. Under Castro's rule, Cuba was declared an atheist state. In the following years, a series of restrictions were placed on religious practice. For one, religious people were not even allowed to join the Communist Party because of its conflict with Marxist philosophy. Castro was angered by the Catholic Church's denunciation of communism and reacted by nationalizing Catholic schools. He then started repressing church publications. He put priests under tight surveillance and expelled them out of the country. In 1961, he even rounded up 130 priests in one night to put them on a train to Spain. Religious gatherings were watched closely, and many priests were silenced or arrested. A propaganda campaign was launched against the Catholic Church. In the late 60s, Christmas was even banned as a holiday. This was an extreme suppression of religion in Cuba.
But as the economic situation in Cuba changed, so did Castro's hold on religion. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Castro eased up on religion and began allowing religious people into the Communist Party. Soon after, it became illegal to discriminate on the basis of religion. Flash forward, the year is 1991. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Cuba was deprived of its main financial provider. Since he was facing an economic crisis, Castro began loosening some of the restrictions that he had on the church and courting Vatican as his diplomatic partner. The Communist Party then dropped its ban on religious individuals in its ranks. An important breakthrough for Castro's policy on religion occurred in January of 1998. He was visited by Pope John Paul II, who urged Cuba to be more open to the world and vice versa. He urged democracy and human rights to Castro as well. Following the visit, Castro created significant gestures towards citizens. For instance, he released 100 prisoners and restored Christmas as a national holiday. Pope John Paul II's visit made very little initial difference to church-to-state relations. It wasn't until 2002 that his regime called the island's 13 bishops to talk. After this, the dialogue between the church and the state became extremely successful, and clear communication has been a key factor to their successful relationship. The church has gradually emerged as one of the largest civil society actors and key non-state social providers within Cuba, taking a significant autonomy in spite of the tight controls.
Despite the advent of religious freedom in Cuba, there still remains a traumatic legacy of Castro's violent suppression. Uber Matos, a member of the old upper class before Castro's revolution, was raised in Yara, a relatively well-off secular agricultural community. But like any other Cuban city, Yara was strife with economic inequality. Matos was raised by a Catholic father who became a successful merchant. As Matos entered the University of Habana, he became a left-wing advocate and joined the M26-7 movement, supplying them with arms from Costa Rica. In fact, Matos rode into Habana on one of the tanks in Castro's victory parade. Matos, as a devout Catholic, opposed Castro and his communist violently suppressive practices. When Matos resigned as an official, citing his opposition to Marxism, he was imprisoned for treason. After Matos was released, he said the reason he opposed Castro was because we fought the revolution with the commitment of complete freedom for our country, true independence, and national sovereignty for the Cuban people. It was clear that the direction Castro was giving the revolution would not lead to independence. It would not lead to sovereignty because liberty encompasses everything that we call political freedom. Once Castro had power, he began to kill freedom. Matos gave an account of another so-called counter-revolutionary, Silvino Rodriguez Barrientos, who was beaten for his religion in prison. Rodriguez worked as a banker before being convicted for distributing counter-revolutionary pamphlets. Many religious counter-revolutionaries in Cuba hailed from affluent backgrounds and from the old upper class. On the other hand, figures like Castro were raised in poverty. When Castro purged supporters of religion from Cuba, he was also partly contributing to a complete overturning of the old class structure from Batista's regime. Moreno Frajinaz, an affluent lawyer from Habana and today a prominent historian in the Cuban Nationalist School, writes that Cuban arts and culture, such as music, dance, and painting, was deeply rooted in religious practices and imagery. When Castro's regime suppressed religion, they stifled Cuba's culture and artists. He also writes that the Cuban identity has always idealized tolerance and diversity, and by imposing a single ideology, Castro tore down what it meant to be a Cuban. Castro's revolution was a bid for freedom from a regime that twistedly interloped with the Church of a Catholic-majority Cuba. As Castro inherited the atheism of communism, he destroyed Catholic schools and churches, deported priests, and excluded believers from his party. With the decline of the Soviet Union, he established friendly relations, outlawed religious discrimination, and released former religious prisoners, fulfilling the revolutionary vision of equality for all.